very much. Now we'll get started with the official part of the day. We'll have two presenters this morning and a short break in between, and time for questions during the presentation, after the presentation, during the break. So I'll first introduce Farra. Farra is a PhD candidate at York University, who, as she said, has been teaching English literacy for over 10 years, including 3 years as an LBS instructor for the College Center. She is a student of Canadian history and literacy theory and has completed research on the creative comic strip writing practices of intermediate learners and the history of literacy education in Canada. She's concerned with how to develop a humanizing pedagogy that embraces the holistic understandings of learning that move beyond a settler narrative. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out here so early in the morning and on a Saturday. Great time to be at home watching cartoons, but here you are. Basically, what I'm going to be presenting to you today is a part of my dissertation. And so I'm looking specifically at the aspect of my dissertation that is focused on how we theorize literacy, so how we conceptualize it. And so when I started off doing my research as kind of a desk researcher, I found that the most common theory was human capital theory. And as a literacy educator, I was like, well, that's more up to create indicators so you determine how much funding you need for the program, but it doesn't actually relate to learning. And I also became very concerned with the human capital framework because, as many of you know, it has a kind of managerial tone to it. And it perpetuates this idea of meritocracy and competition. And usually with any competition model, it's always going to create a hierarchy. And I'm concerned, well, how does that support democratic practice? And so I said, well, you know what? I need to find out how other people are thinking about literacy. And the reason I wanted to look at how LBS educators think about literacy is because they often work with students who don't go through the traditional schooling method of the K-12 system followed by university or followed by college. And so they often work with learners who have experienced forms of social isolation. Some of the schools I visit, I work with educators who work with students who have experienced prison, who have lived in healthcare residencies, work with senior citizens who now live in retirement homes, sometimes work with learners with special needs. And so I felt that these group of educators who often are not put in scholarly research have something very important to say about how literacy should be theorized. And so what I did was I had some interviews and observations of teacher practice from the LBS programs in order to collect data to then analyze into a grounded theory analysis. So the aim of grounded theory is to look at many selections of data and be able to use it to work together in order to build a theory to understand how educators conceptualize literacy. And so the answer I got was that educators from the LBS sector, those who participate in the study, and I should mention there's 14 of them, and the educators that tended to volunteer tended to have like a lot of experience teaching. So we're looking at educators who maybe had like at least 10 years of experience. One of my participants had 30 years of experience, and he was like, yeah, one more year and I'm going to retire, but I'll participate in your study. It is skewed towards educators who have a lot of experience working with learners, just a heads up. And also a lot of the educators who participate in the study participate in research too. So they kind of understand the research process. Through this theory, what I found was that educators tend to conceptualize literacy as having three main aspects: a pragmatic aspect, and I use the word pragmatic instead of experience because right now policy is going towards this notion of experiential education, which is not necessarily the same as experience-based education. But if you hear me use the word experience-based education, I'm referring to pragmatic education. And then also that they emphasize that there is an important cognitive aspect to learning literacy. And then there's also there is also a social aspect of literacy. And when you bring these three analytical frameworks of literacy together, what you have is a very critical, holistic approach to their practice. And so, I mean, festivals have literacy has documented this, like, I think since the 90s, that, educators tend to have a holistic approach to teaching. And so what this presentation does is it kind of unpacks what holistic means from those three analytical perspectives. And so I thought that one way to kind of begin talking about how educators theorize literacy is to do a little bit of a word exercise, because one of the things I find is a challenge is explaining to people how complex it is to conceptualize and understand the work of literacy educators. I mean, some educators in the process of the interview, I'm asking them to empty their mind of thoughts to me. They're like kind of exhausted because so much goes on and it's so much is not put on paper. So with this exercise, I've given everybody a kind of word on a card. Does everyone receive one? And so now looking at that word, one way to understand how educators theorize practice is to take the information that the educators shared with me and actually put them in the form of questions. So looking at the word, I want you to think about how you would answer these questions. Okay? So is the word a common part of your vocabulary? That's the first question. I already see someone shake their head no. When you see the word, what does it make you think about? So what's the first? Is it a memory? Is it an impression? Is it something that just passed your mind recently? Does the word evoke a strong or a mild emotional response? So this is important because some people, when they see specific words, it doesn't just raise this is what the meaning is in my head, but also an emotion to it. How does this word relate to your life? Some words might actually have a more important relation to your life than other words, depending on your culture, your gender, right? How does this, do you recall when you first heard that word? So some words might be something you only became acquainted with recently. And some of the words, maybe there's something that are associated deep in your childhood. So next set. Does someone, and so at this point, does anyone want to share what their word is? Thank you.
Silk.
Silk, okay. And so with silk, when you heard that word, what did you think of?
When you gave it to me, I was like, ooh, I like it because it's textural for me. It's a fabric for me, and it's a tactile experience.
Mm-hmm. And do you recall a tactile experience that you had when you think of silk?
Yeah, it brings me to Japan. When I was in Japan, I got to feel a lot of different fabrics there. So my memory takes me to a different place and space.
Yeah, and so it kind of shows that when we learn words, the complex thing is that they have meanings to it. And these meanings are often related to our inner experiences. And they often are attached to memories as well. And so one of the things that the educators emphasize to me is that when you teach literacy, experience matters. And so sometimes you have to facilitate a rich experience that is emotional, that is tactile, in order to really bring a connection between the word and its meaning, And so now, if I could just ask you further, did anyone else in this room have that word? Okay, so it's one of the ones that didn't make the doubles. But I want you to imagine if I had that word, silk. Do you think that I would have the same experience as you would?
Unlikely.
Unlikely, yeah.
Unless we were traveling together.
Perhaps. Do you think that we would, if we saw the word silk, we would both know right away what its meaning was?
No.
Okay, and do you think that maybe we both might have an understanding of this notion of silk being texture oriented?
It could be that we do have that basic understanding, but everything else around that basic understanding would be different.
Precisely. So it's interesting because on the one hand, you can't know if we have a shared meaning, but there is the possibility that we do. And we might not have the same experience of the word, but we might have the opportunity of finding something that's common. So for instance, I often associate silk with Japan myself, because although I've never gone to Japan, when I was in school, the memory that comes into my mind is the Silkworm documentary that I watched on one of those old projectors that you see the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it goes really fast when you rewind it backwards. But yeah, and so it's interesting because there is a kind of collective conscious experience with us of a shared meaning, but then at the same time, there is a very subjective aspect to our understanding. Okay, so this is the complex thing that educators think about when they think about literacy. Because on the one hand, you want to facilitate learning opportunity that's going to bring a rich subjective experience, but then at the same time, you want to create a subjective experience. But then at the same time, you want to create an objective understanding so that students can use it as a means of communication to build relations with others. So as a holistic thing, it's a very complex thing that educators do. And so that's kind of the whole understanding that I wanted to start the presentation on as I break it down now into 3 analytical parts, because of course, in the mind of the educator, all of this is happening simultaneously. There were some other questions, which is how might gender, race, culture, and socioeconomic situation shape the understanding of the word, right? So one of the person who's nodded, I gave her Louis Vuitton, right? And so, I don't know if you want to share how you know about Louis Vuitton.
Don't know exactly how I do, but I actually had quite a strong taste towards it.
Yeah.
I love this word. And to me, it invokes, I don't know, I've never been that interested in brand name stuff, but certainly maybe, and some people who have a lot of money might think that they should buy this kind of brand. They are. Just know that it's a brand name that is really rich.
Yeah, and that's the thing, because some of the words that we use in class, depending on whose socioeconomic status, whose race, whose gender and privileges, it can either create senses of positivity towards the word or negativity towards the word. And so that's another thing that educators often have to consider about the language that they bring into the classroom. And at the same time, the experience and the discussion of this taste, as negative as it is, it's also can create a positive learning experience, because it leads to a wider discussion about class and race issues or gender issues that are a lot more situated in one's position and experience. So it puts you in the place of reflection and creates the beginnings of a critical pedagogy. By the way, if I say anything crazy, just stop me and say, what do you mean by that? So the first thing that I found was that educators tend to have a pragmatic understanding of literacy, and this follows the tradition of John Dewey's theories, which is that learning is a conscious reflection on experience. So learning happens when we think about the experiences that we have. They're situated in those experiences. And so what happens is, when we have a great experience, if we have the space to sit and reflect upon it, what that ends up doing is giving us an opportunity to spiritualize that experience with language. And as a result, when we use those words, they always evoke both its meaning and an emotion at the same time. And at the same time, by spiritualize it, we put it in that place where it's abstract enough we can use it as communication to work with each other. And so John Dewey believed that the reason we have democracies and the reason why we work together is because we discovered that when we work together, we can develop labor capacities that increase our survival. But those capacities always need to be situated in experiences. Because otherwise, then we end up doing things without, as habit, rather than through thought and reflection. And when that happens, that's when our apparatus of democracy begins to shake a bit. This also follows Indigenous educators' understandings of experience. And so one of the things that I found the educators did was that, when we have literacy learning experiences, they're not just cognitive, they're not just in the head, they're physical, they're emotional, they're social, they're spiritual. And we need to have that full education experience. And because what happens is, yes?
Earlier, connected to this point, you differentiated between learning as experience and experiential learning.
Yeah.
I wondered if you can touch a little bit because I know in the common frameworks on experiential learning, John Dewey and others are cited as the founders. So how, in your sense,
when John Dewey talks about experiential learning, he's talking about bringing the learner's experience into the classroom. So the classroom, in many ways, becomes a space to reflect on experience. Now, with experiential learning as it's advanced in policy, it often is associated with giving students co-ops. And I'm happy with giving students co-ops in the workforce. I think facilitating experiences are as good as bringing the learner's experience into the classroom. And some of the educators in the study emphasized that they would organize trips so that way students would have rich experiences that they can then talk about in the classroom. And then because all the students in the room went on that trip, they have a shared experience to reflect on. So they also bring that social dimension in. So that's good. But the problem is that the way co-ops are often organized, they're like internships. The student goes off on a placement, and it's not at all integrated or attached into their education process. So the education classroom then doesn't become a space to reflect on that experience. And so I feel that is where there's a disconnect between Dewey's theory and this experiential learning that's often advanced in popular, trendy policy frameworks. Yeah. So the thing is that these experiences, they're holistic. And so the educators often emphasize that it's more than just cognitive. It's also emotional, physical. It's also social. And it's important that we add that to the learning process, because what happens is when we have a framework where all we focus is on a student's labor potential, what we end up doing is advancing a settler narrative. And so when we talk about holistic education, it often is combating, decolonizing this settler narrative. Indigenous scholars like the Anishinaabe believe that the human being should be valued as a whole person, intrinsic into themselves, not just for their labor capacity. Canada has a long history of emphasizing labor potential, whether you're a settler or whether you're an Indigenous person. And colonization is often linked to the long exploitation of labor. And so when you have a holistic pedagogy, in many ways it can actually challenge this settler narrative. Another scholar that some of the participants talked about was the work by Jenny Forsman. And so she wrote about the experience of violence and how that makes it difficult to educate students. And when I look at her research in relation to John Dewey's theories, I can see why. John Dewey, one of the things he says is that if you have a positive experience, then you'll want to continue. But if you have a negative experience, you won't want to continue. And for some people who have experienced violence, there are certain language that spiritualizes that violence. So when you have those words, while it might have a benign meaning to someone, it might be symbolically connected to the violence that you experienced. And by by working with that word, you're invoking it. And so one of the things that Jenny Horstman does is she says that trauma is the reaction to violence. And so when we're in the space of conscious reflection, we end up, in the case, representing the violence. And, when you think about colonialism, that's a historical trauma. Sometimes people don't talk about the violence because of the fear of revoking it, because that violence affects the person who's listening as well as the person. Now, I think that what we should do with our literacy classrooms is we should find a way to help people work through violence. And if we can't, at least be understanding and respecting of it. And so what some of the educators in the study told me is that, they don't ever force anyone to participate in any of the activities because they don't know if it's been associated with a negative experience like violence. And so although they do a lot of work to encourage participation, encourage students to do the activities, if a student kind of shows an aversion to the activity, then they'll try to gently inquire why it is. And if they find that it's creating a lot of emotional difficulties or it's creating a lot of isolation where the student shuts down and doesn't want to participate, they are willing to change the activity, change the vocabulary, and hope that that student might be willing to work through that at another time and place. And so one thing I've learned is that educators in the LBS program, they spend a lot of time dialoguing with their students to find out about their experiences. And they use that very dialogue to support every aspect of the learning process, from the goal that they set, and they do this in consultation with the learner, from the type of materials they use in the classroom. They try to keep them relevant to the learner's experience, but they also give the learner choice as to ones that they'll use. And then they also, some of the educators I talk to, they even talk to the student about the strategies that they use because they want to encourage social interaction, but certain social interactions will make students uncomfortable. So what they try to do is they try to have like social participation at the end goal, but then they'll do small activities that will lead up to it. So whether it's a pair share, whether it's role playing, whether it's working in a small group, working in a large group, so they often systematize the type of activities they'll do. And they introduce learners to the different possibilities out there, and the learners choose whether they'll take it on or not. Did anyone have any questions? Okay. So the second thing is the cognitive aspect of literacy. And so educators, of course, they believe that literacy is tied to cognitive processes, including how we remember and how we process emotion. And these processes mean that literacy is connected to one's notion of self-worth and one's notion of self-esteem. And what I found is that within the cognitive literacy community, there are theorists who are aligned with that perspective, and they often approach holistic ideas of literacy. And so what I found was that educators tended to see holistic literacy as the most significant of the cognitive strategies, because this one incorporates the value of emotion, the value of experience, and it involves using texts that are actually in the learner's life. But many of the educators also said, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't learn the other strategies, because different students need different things. The word I heard over and over again is one size does not fit all. And so sometimes by using these other strategies, you might actually have more success because it's based on what the student wants and what the student needs. And so if the student, you can tell, is really struggling with the word to simple connection, maybe a review of the phonics method is the best way to help them. Or sometimes what you have to do is you have to teach them sight word strategies to see the whole word and in order to help them predict the meaning. Sometimes they need whole language support where they need to see analytically how text is organized. They need to work with the text itself so that they see all the words integrated with each other. And the nice thing about having different cognitive strategies is if a student has experiences that makes it very difficult for them to talk about language use, if you have a phonetic strategy, you don't necessarily have to use words that have particular meanings. But of course, the holistic strategy is the most ideal because it's very much integrated with the life of the student, and therefore it's easier to set goals around that because you're working with the actual tasks that the student needs in order to achieve their goals. And so, of course, one of the things they said is as much as possible, they want to encourage students to be self-directed. So a lot of the educators I went to visit, they would have portions of their class where students would work individually and they would work on their own. And then the educator would take the time to meet with each student individually. And in that place, they would get an understanding of the student's experience and they would support them with the task and they will help them find the student's strategies so that they can best accomplish the task that they want to do. And so that tended to work successfully. Other educators, they had days where they did social activities where everybody would come in and do them, and then days where they would do individual activities. And so the other thing about that is that way students, if they're not ready to do social activities, they would choose not to come on those days. Whereas if they want mostly to do social activities, those are the days they would come in. Although ideally, you would like students to do both, working towards their goal and also widening their circle of social participation. And so one of the reasons why self-directed learning is so important is because it allows learners to take ownership of the learning process and the literacy products that they make. And this is important because this is what helps students develop the analytical intellectual capacities of post-formal thought. And we are living in a digital age where we no longer have libraries and educators who filter the knowledge that comes to learners. Learners need to do that for themselves, especially when working with digital media. So this post-formal thought and this self-direction is very important. And so when we look at standardized tests, they often are not in support of self-directed learning. Because first of all, they take away the process, the students' input in the process. The teacher has to develop a program to help those students pass those tasks. They lose ownership of the process. You also lose ownership of the product. A lot of students, those standardized tests are copyright protected. They'll do the test, they'll be submitted, they'll get a score, but they maybe will never get to see the project. And then the project that they do will be integrated into their life and their goals. And so that's why these standardized tasks and tests are problematic. Although educators explain to me, we wouldn't mind having them as a good diagnostic tool, however, to give us more information on how to program for the learner. So if it's kind of like diagnostic tools, they're good for assessing for learning, but not necessarily for helping the learner take ownership of the learning process. And then the final thing is to look at holistic learning at a social level. And so essentially the educator said, yeah, literacy, it does have a social function. So they aren't rejecting functionalist theory. The problem is that when the norms created by literacy are oppressive, when they are not empowering to the learner. And so what I found was most educators I interviewed, they had a critical understanding of literacy, that yes, we need to teach them the norms to meet their goals and to be successful, but we also have to have the conversation with them about how their literacy practice relate to structures of power, And so and this is particularly important because a lot of their learners have experiences of being socially isolated, where the normative practices of society causes them to be excluded. And so a lot of the work that they do involves facilitating that kind of inclusion. And so again, they do kind of levels of peer interaction and social participation. Some educators also do community outreach so that they'll help students connect with other communities in order to allow them to have a holistic experience. Like one of the participants I talked to, she's like, well, you can't always have holistic programming in your school, but if you're attached to a community center, what you can do is you can integrate that holistic experiences by drawing upon other communities of practice that are there and introducing them to folks, especially since some literacy programs don't always recognize literacy practices of other cultures that would be empowering to the learners. So sometimes the educators would specifically connect them to a community of practice that would help them develop that skill. And then also the educators, so one of the things I found, some of the educators actually referenced Farra when they responded to my interviews. And one of the things that Farra talks about is the totality of experience when you analyze students' learning. So what I found was in research, we sometimes focus on the in-class activity, and that's one frame of research. And then some of the research focuses on the out of class activity and how it affects the in-class activity. And what Farra was saying was you have to go further. You have to encompass the students' social history. That students, their experiences are framed by these historical realities they bring to the classroom. And so a research project actually has to look at that full circle. Okay. And so essentially, I would like to conclude that the model of literacy looks like this. It integrates social, experiential, and the cognitive. That's how educators theorize literacy in the LBS program. But when they apply these theories into practice, it's done with a critical and a holistic